When Johnny was 23 years old, he was dating the mega pop star Katy Perry. And although their romance was relatively short, apparently it was very intense because Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were apparently about Johnny. But Johnny's real rise to stardom occurred 2 years later in 2008 when he was cast as the character Half Sack on the critically acclaimed motorcycle drama Sons of Anarchy. Johnny decided that he wasn't going to pursue any serious acting roles for the time being. In October of 2011, he decided to take his motorcycle out and just go ride around and clear his head. And so he drove for about 2 hours to the west of LA out into the desert where he lost control of his bike and he crashed. After getting to the hospital, his injuries were determined to be relatively minor, except they were concerned he might have a head injury. However, after testing negative for a concussion, he was said to be okay by doctors and he was sent home. But when he got home from the hospital, he was not okay. Johnny just kind of abruptly says, "I'm gonna go out for a walk." So he gets up, he's only got his pajamas on, no shoes on, he walks out the door, and as he's walking down the road, he gets maybe 10 or 15 feet away from his parents' house when he hears someone screaming, and he thinks it's coming from the apartment that was right next to his parents' house. And so he breaks into the apartment, but there's no one in the apartment, it's totally vacant. And so as he's in this apartment, wondering what's going on, the 2 men that owned the apartment, they came home and they see Johnny standing there, and they told him he had to leave immediately, and instead of leaving immediately, Johnny grabbed a nearby glass bottle and he charged at them and hit them both over the head with the bottle before they managed to restrain him and hold him down until the police showed up. Johnny claimed he was acting in self-defense, but the police didn't believe him, and so they charged him with trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon, and they sent him to jail. When Johnny's father was finally able to come to the jail and bail his son out, it had been 8 days, and in those 8 days, Johnny had been moved from general population to a psych ward because he was banging his head against the inside of his cell, and at one point he had tried to jump off of a balcony, and he was just generally acting unhinged. But despite Johnny's obvious issues after coming home from jail, over the next few weeks he did actually seem to be improving, to the point where at the end of January, so about a month after he came home from jail, his parents allowed him to move out and go live on his own. About a week after moving into this place in Santa Monica, he was arrested for punching some random stranger in the head outside of a yogurt shop, but he was ultimately released on $20,000 bail. A couple of days later, Johnny, fully clothed, just walked into the ocean, and when he was pulled out, he had to be brought to the hospital to be treated for hypothermia. A couple of days after getting out of the hospital, he was arrested again, this time for trying to break into a woman's apartment in Santa Monica. He claimed he thought it was his friend's apartment, but nobody believed him, so he was brought to jail and then released on bail again. After this second arrest in Santa Monica, Johnny's parents finally convinced him to go see a doctor about this potential head injury, but the doctor Johnny wound up seeing did not suspect a head injury. Instead, he suspected schizophrenia or bipolar, which are 2 very serious mental disorders. And so he prescribed some medication to Johnny that would treat both of those disorders, and Johnny was on his way. Johnny refused to take the medication and refused to go see another doctor, and so his condition just continued to get worse. Johnny was still facing serious jail time for the break-in and assault against those 2 men in the apartment next to his parents' home. When Johnny's father finally came to pick him up from prison, Johnny was at an all-time low. Even though he had only been in jail for 6 weeks instead of the year he was supposed to be there, it was clear that amount of time had done an enormous amount of damage to him. And so on the car ride home from prison, Johnny just kind of sheepishly asked his father, "Hey Dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa and just see if there's any way I can move back in?" And Michael's thinking to himself, I hadn't thought of that, but the writer's villa was the last place Johnny was when his life was still in order. It was probably the last place he was happy. Johnny stayed with his parents that weekend, and then on Monday, September 24th, he packed up his stuff and he moved back into the villa. 2 days later, a 70-year-old man named Dan Blackburn, who was actually neighbors to the writer's villa property, he was looking out his front window at this man who was standing out in the road. He only had on jeans and red shoes, he had no shirt on, and he was very sweaty, and he was just kind of frantically pacing around the road. And after about 15 minutes of this kind of strange pacing in the road, this guy turns and walks directly towards Dan's property, goes right up to the front step and starts knocking on the door. Dan was definitely a little bit concerned, but he shut the curtain, he walked over to the door, he looks out the peephole, and there's this guy standing there with bright blue eyes that are all wide, and he's looking at the peephole as if he can see through and see Dan, but he can't. And so Dan reaches down and he opens the door just a little bit and he looks out, and the guy outside looks at him and goes, "Hi, I'm John, I'm your new neighbor." It would turn out John was Johnny Lewis. And so Dan opened the door a little bit farther and he looks at him and he goes, "Hi, John, nice to meet you." And before the two men could have any sort of conversation, Johnny just abruptly turned around and walked away. And so Dan is totally puzzled by this strange interaction he's just had with Johnny Lewis. And he's watching him as he just walks back to the road, he walks back over and goes inside the villa and disappears. About 30 minutes later, Dan is doing his own thing in his house when he hears his wife outside screaming for him to come outside. And so Dan runs out the front door, he goes into his driveway, which is between his property and the writer's villa, and he sees his wife is standing on the driveway, horrified, pointing up towards the back of their house. He looks down, and back near their back deck, Johnny Lewis is standing on top of the guy that Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck. Johnny is just raining blows down on this guy. He's got a piece of wood too that he's hitting him with, and the worker is sitting there trying to shield himself. There's blood all over him, and Dan instinctively just runs over to Johnny. Johnny's not seen Dan at this point. Dan gets right up to him and he grabs him by the shoulder and he tries pulling Johnny off. He's screaming at Johnny to stop, but Johnny just seems totally unfazed. And so finally, after Dan yanks on Johnny hard enough, Johnny jumps up, turns around, and levels Dan square in the face. Dan falls to the ground, and when he looks up, Johnny is just standing over him, looking at him with no expression on his face. But Dan wasn't going to waste any time. He jumped up and he clocked Johnny square in the side of the head, but it had no effect on Johnny. He still just stared at Dan, completely expressionless. And so Dan grabbed a nearby lawn chair and practically broke it over the head of Johnny, but again, it had no effect on Johnny. He just stood there completely expressionless, staring at Dan. And so at this point, Dan just grabs the worker who can barely stand and he runs back down the driveway. He grabs his wife and they run towards the house to go inside. And the three of them manage to get inside the house. And as they're shutting the big, heavy door, Johnny comes bounding up and he gets right in front and he jams his arm in the space between the door and the wall. So they can't close the door because it's getting stuck on his arm. And so all three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the painter, are putting all of their weight on this huge wooden door onto Johnny's arm. And Johnny is just trying to grab them the whole time. And so finally, the three of them start raising the door and slamming it as hard as they can on Johnny's arm. And finally, after several hard blows to his arm, Johnny retracted his arm and they were able to shut the door and lock it. And so at this point, Dan's wife and the painter ran around the house, closing every window, locking every door. Meanwhile, Dan went to the side window that looked out towards the writer's villa property, and he got his phone out and he called 911. And so after he tells 911 what's going on and he hangs up, Johnny suddenly just appears running down his driveway as if he's running back towards the back deck. But he stops almost right in front of Dan's window. He turns and he starts running towards the villa property. And then he gets to this huge wooden fence that surrounded the entire villa property that was at least, 8, 9, 10 feet. And he very easily just jumps, grabs the top, and catapults himself right over the top and then disappeared inside of the villa. Within minutes, the police showed up and they went inside the villa and they could not believe what they found. After Johnny, for the first time, walked up to Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I'm John. I'm your new neighbor." He turned around and Dan watched him as he left his property and made his way back and went inside the villa. Once Johnny got inside the villa, he made his way up to the second floor and he went into Kathy Davis's room where she was sitting. Now, Kathy most likely turned and saw Johnny standing in the doorway. She probably was not scared. Instead, her motherly instincts kicked in and she probably said, "Hey, are you okay? Can I help you? What's going on?" And as she probably stood up and made her way over to make sure he was okay, Johnny, for reasons no one understands, proceeded to beat and kick and strangle her. And then when she fell to the ground and was totally helpless, Johnny proceeded to either stomp on her skull repeatedly, or he hit her over the head repeatedly with a rusty hammer that was later found in his bedroom. But no matter how Johnny did it, he managed to severely fracture her skull, and that's what ultimately killed her. After killing Kathy, Johnny tracked down her beloved cat and killed the cat the same way. Afterwards, Johnny ran out of the villa, and that's when he spotted Dan's house painter just sitting outside, and he walked over to him and just began beating him. And just like the attack on Kathy and her cat, this attack on this house painter appeared to have no motive as well. After Dan came outside and managed to fight Johnny off, and then when Dan went back inside the house with his wife and with the painter, Johnny stood outside for a few minutes before running down Dan's driveway, and then Johnny disappeared inside of the villa. Once Johnny was in the villa, it's believed he climbed up to the upper patio or onto the roof of the villa itself, and from there he either jumped or fell to his death on the driveway below. His death was officially ruled an accident, not a suicide. After the news broke about what had happened at the writer's villa, everybody assumed Johnny must have been on some really hardcore That's the only explanation for why someone would act the way he acted. But when his toxicology report came back, it showed he had absolutely no of any kind, legal or illegal, in his system. Some believe Johnny really did have some undiagnosed head injury from that motorcycle accident, and this head injury is responsible for his violent outbursts. Others disagree and say the head injury had nothing to do with it. Johnny clearly had some undiagnosed mental disorder, but to this day, no one knows for sure why Johnny did what he did. All we know is an innocent woman and her cat were needlessly killed.